Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video lecture. Today we are going to be talking about ethnographies, a research method that is favored by anthropologists, but also used in sociology. Okay, so as I said, we're going to be talking about ethnographies, and we're going to be talking at the end, a little bit about the reading for this lecture. Philip Bourgois and his book In Search of Respect, where he does an ethnography of crack cocaine dealers who were living and working in East Harlem. So at first, we're going to just be talking generally about what an ethnography is, kind of giving an overview. Then giving some examples of ethnographies by sociologists, and then talk about what the role of the observer is in doing an ethnography, and then lastly talk about the example reading In Search of Respect. Okay, so to begin, what is an ethnography? So an ethnography is, another qualitative method. Essentially, it is a method in which the researcher goes and lives with the social group that they are interested in and that they are studying, right? That you are going to live with this social group for an extended period of time. Typically an ethnographer will live with the group that they're studying for a year or 2 years, sometimes even 3 years, right? So you're really immersing yourself in the world and life of the people that you are studying, right? And so the idea here is that what you're trying to do is you are trying to see the world through their eyes, right? That you are immersing yourself in their life, in the group, and you are trying to, in some sense, walk in their shoes, right? That you are going to be part of their everyday experience. You're going to do everything that they do, and you're going to participate in all the mundane, boring activities, and really get a sense of what it is like to see the world through their eyes, right? So this is twofold, right? So on the one hand, you are trying to familiarize yourself with them, right? You're trying to understand, really get down deep and see how they understand the world, but also you're trying to get accepted by the group, right? You want them to open up to you, and so that takes time. Any form of research is kind of a relationship, right? And the longer you can build, the longer you can spend with a group, the stronger that relationship becomes, and the more open the social group can be, right? And so one way to think about this is to use the term from anthropology of what's called thick description, right? So what I mean by this is that, or what is meant by this, is that in some sense, an ethnography is the opposite of a survey. So, and we're still going to be talking about, surveys, in the future. But, an ethnography is a situation in which, rather than collecting data from, thousands of people or many people, you're really kind of collecting an immense amount of data from a small group of people, right? And so what you're doing is what's called a thick description. And so this term comes from an anthropologist called Clifford Geertz, who went and did an ethnography of the people of Bali, right? So he was an American anthropologist. He went and lived 2 years, 3 years in the Indonesian island of Bali, and he kind of, lived in their world and, understand how the Balinese, culture is and what their society is like. And so he comes up with this idea of a thick description to really kind of get an immense detailed account of your social group, right? You're not looking for surface level. You're not looking for just a kind of a glimpse. You want to see an intimate and kind of complete understanding of what your group is like, right? Not just their political beliefs or not just their religious beliefs, but you got kind of everything about them and how it's all interconnected. And so the idea here is a thick description, a complete account that really delves deeply into the world of the people that you are studying. And it's really about richness and really understanding the complexity of of your subjects. Another aspect of anthropology, of ethnographies, is what's called anthropological strangeness. So the idea here is that many social groups are different than the social group that we belong to. Each one of us belongs to and has grown up in. Right? There are many societies, many cultures out there that are very different from the experiences I have had as a person. And so when I see, when I travel or see a culture that is different than mine, I can experience what is called culture shock. It's a sense of strangeness, a sense of, bizarreness, that everything seems weird and exotic, right? And so when an anthropologist, a person doing an ethnography first enters a very different social group, then it can all seem very strange and bizarre and weird, right? And there can be sometimes a desire to what's called fetishize, like to keep that exoticness, to say, describe how weird and strange the group is. But actually, that's not really what you want to do in an ethnography. Rather than having the social group remain strange and bizarre and exotic, what you're trying to do with your ethnography is you're trying to make sense of the social group. You're trying to see how your subjects see the world, right? You're trying to create and write an account that makes them seem meaningful, right? That makes them, allows anybody to understand, okay, this is why they're doing what they're doing. This is why they see the world the way they do, right? It makes the group not seem strange, not seem bizarre, but rather seem it makes sense, that they become understandable, right? This is the idea of anthropological strangeness, and weirdly enough, in terms of terminology, you're actually trying to make it not strange, right? That at first is strange, but over time, what you're really trying to do is make it seem not strange, right? Make it seem, in some sense, normal. One note about just kind of a terminology here. Because this week we're talking about ethnographies, but I've also mentioned participant observation, and so participant observation and ethnographies are sometimes interchangeable words, right? And so participant observation is basically you as the researcher are not just observing the social group, but you are participating in their life, right? That you are not just an outsider, standing on the edge and watching. Rather, you are engaged, you are active, you are participating in the activities of the social group that you are studying. And the argument here is that's the only real way to understand the social group. That you can't understand them by just watching from the outside. That you have to participate. That you have to belong and take part in the world of the people that you're studying. Right. And so this idea of participant observation is an important one. And sometimes it's this kind of overlapping term. Ethnography versus participant observation really can kind of be somewhat interchangeable. The participant observation is sometimes more favored by sociologists. Right. And as I mentioned, ethnographies are really a method that is widely used in anthropology. Right. What anthropologists are typically told to do is, you study, you do, your studies in one country, you get your degree in country, but then you will go to a foreign country, another place, another culture, and study that world. Right. So if you're an American anthropology student, then you might go to Japan and study that, that culture, that world, to see, to really kind of immerse yourself in something that's very foreign. Right. And but the same thing applies to actually, you don't have to go to another country. You can just go to a culture that's very different from your own. And so this is an example of In Search of Respect by Philippe Bourgois. He is actually an anthropologist, right? But rather than going to some foreign country, what he does is he studies a culture that's very foreign to him, crack dealers in East Harlem. But we'll see more about him in a bit. So what are some, as I mentioned, ethnographies are favored by anthropologists, but they are also a method that is used by sociologists. So what are some kind of well-known examples of ethnographies used by sociologists? Right, so there's actually a pretty long history here. So one of the first ethnographies by a sociologist is by William Foote White, Street Corner Society. And so what White did is he, in the early 1930s, he went and lived in a slum district of Boston, right? So this was a period of time in which there was kind of still mass immigration, and there was many Italian immigrants moving into Boston. And so what he did is he wanted to understand this immigrant experience. And so he went and lived in this neighborhood and spent 18 months living with an Italian family. And so what he does is he describes the experience of local gangs that kind of sprung up in that area, and in how these, what he called corner boys, how they were distinct in their cultural views and their understanding of the world, and why it was that they were deviant, why it was that they were breaking the law. Right. And so again, the goal here is not just to condemn or to criticize, deviant behavior or the lawbreakers, but to understand what it was that they were doing. Why is it that they were being actions that were unlawful? Right. So this is one of the first examples of an early ethnography by a sociologist. Another good example is by Bruno Latour, the French sociologist, and his amazing ethnography, Laboratory Life. And so Latour actually does a very different type of ethnography. Again, rather than going to a foreign country and examining some exotic tribe, rather than looking and living among street gangs, Latour goes and studies scientists. So what he does is for about 2 years, he lives and works at the Salk Laboratory in California, right? It's a biology laboratory. He works as a technician there, and then he's also observing and recording and studying the scientists who work there, right? As pictured in this picture right here. And so what he wanted to do is he wanted to understand, these people's lives, right? How can we understand, these white-coated scientists, and how is their culture a way to see the world and understand how science is created. One more example, last example, a more recent one, is by C.J. Pascoe, Dude, You're a Fag, Masculinity and Sexuality in High School. And so what Pascoe does is that she goes and studies another social group that she is disconnected from, that of high school teenagers in America. And so she spends about 1.5 years working at a high school in California and understanding how students there, both male and female, how they think about sex and masculinity, right? What they think it means to be male, right? So she spends her time, observing classrooms, interviewing the students, going to, kind of all the social gatherings like dances and school events, right? And so what she found, as the kind of title suggests, is that, there was this kind of pressure among males and for males to act very kind of manly, right? To act tough. And that a part of this was not being homosexual, right? That there was a kind of condemnation or a separation to not appear homosexual at all, right? And so again, she didn't want to just condemn this or criticize this. She wanted to understand why was this happening, right? And that the only way to understand why this was happening was to see the world through these teenagers' lives. Okay, now let's step back and talk a little bit more abstractly, right? Now we can talk about the role of the observer, right? So the ethnographer is going to live and study a social group for an extended period of time. And so the question is, well, what's their role going to be in that group? You know, how are they going to live and function in that group? And so essentially, there are basically three kind of different ways that a person, a researcher, can be involved in the social group that they're interested in. And we can think of this as along a scale from involvement to detachment, from being more involved in the group to being more detached from the group. So on one end, you have one that's kind of really involved. Here, a complete participant. Then midway through, you have a participant observer, that terminology again. And then at the more detached scale, end of the scale, you have the complete observer. So let's kind of talk about these kind of one by one. Okay, so first off, we have the complete participant, right? So here, the researcher is completely immersed and completely involved in the social group. How do they do this? The social group does not know that they are a researcher, right? And so they're actually doing this secretly or covertly, right? And so you're doing deception to basically to pretend to be a normal member of the group, right? And so in some sense, they are just kind of being a spy, kind of secretly being involved in the group, and nobody actually knows that they are a researcher or a sociologist or observer, right? And so they are really, the idea is that by doing this, they're really able to get people to open up because nobody knows that they're even a researcher, and so they're just getting the authentic, real heart of it. This, to be honest, this role of observer is not really practiced that often anymore because it has really serious ethical problems, right? There's no way that the group or the members of the group can give informed consent, right, to agree to be studied because they don't even know that they're being studied. You're secret, you're a spy, you're covertly studying them. And so, there's no real way for the group to really give permission to be studied. And so that's a real ethical problem that actually makes this form of ethnography very hard to accomplish in contemporary times. Okay, so it has happened in the past, but not really that frequent anymore. But it's basically where you're a covert observer. Okay, what's next? Midway point. Kind of involved, a little bit of detached. This is a participant observer. So here you're a part of the group. You're participating in the group's activities. You are immersed in their life, but they know that you're studying them, right? They know that you're a researcher. They know that you're, what you're there for. And so you're kind of, you're not being covert, you're being upfront. You're being like, oh, I'm here to observe, right? There are some issues with this because, because they know that you're an observer, they might act differently. They might be a little bit suspicious of you. They might be a little bit guarded, wondering what you're going to write, et cetera, et cetera. But it really allows you to be open. It allows you to take notes. It allows you to interview people. It allows you to record people if they allow it. And so it allows you to participate and immerse yourself in the group's life, the group's world, but still be able to observe. At the other end of the scale, now we have complete observer, right? Here, the person is there at the group's functions, they're interviewing people, they're talking to people, but they're not really participating in the group, right? They are standing on the edge, kind of just watching, right? And so here, it's kind of a different issue. Here, the question becomes, can you really know the group? can you really see the world through their eyes if you're not really partaking in the group's activities, right? There might be it might be a situation in which the observer doesn't really want to partake, fully in the group's activities. You don't really want to sell cocaine, right? Going back to the example for the reading for today, right? So we have these different scales. Complete participant is really involved, and they're involved because they're so immersed in the group. Participant observer is midway, involved but also somewhat detached, and then the complete observer is much more detached. Now let me talk about two problems with doing an ethnography. First is the problem of reactivity, and then second is the kind of an old-fashioned word that's kind of out of date now, called going native. Okay, so let's talk about the first one first. So the problem of reactivity is basically the problem in that because most of the time people know that they are being observed, that they know there's a researcher there taking notes and recording them, they're going to act different, right? They're going to react differently to there being a researcher there. And so you're not really getting their authentic, true selves, right? They're gonna be more guarded, or they're gonna act differently because they know they're being watched by an outsider, right? And so this is a problem in all forms of research, right? It's a problem, but particularly a problem in ethnography, because what you're trying to do is really get, a thick description. You're trying to get, all the nuance, all the complexity of the group's life. And so if they're holding back, if they're not really being honest, then you're kind of that's a problem for you. A way, and sometimes what the ethnographer is trying to do is really spend enough time with the social group that they gain the group's trust, right? That's just why it takes so long, right? That you're gonna, you can't just fly in, a couple of days and take some interviews and go. No, you have to do this for a year, 2 years to really get to know the group and have the group trust you, right? To be less reactive, to not act differently if you weren't there. And so, you have to kind of, in some sense, get to become an insider, and to become an insider takes time. Okay, so that's the first problem. The problem of people reacting differently because they know they're being observed, and then basically the problem around that is getting accepted, and that takes time. Okay, the second problem is with the term going native, is that now it's not that the group is going to change its behavior because it's being observed. Now the problem is with the researcher. Now the problem is that as the researcher spends more and more time with the group, then the researcher might be influenced. Now the researcher might not be able to give an objective account of the group, right? They're immersed in the group so much that their life has become intertwined with the group that they can no longer give an unbiased account of the group, right? And so they start just being a member of the group. They start really thinking of themselves not as an outsider, not as a somebody observing from the outside, but as a member of the group. And so now they can no longer be trusted really to give a objective, unbiased account of what the group is like, right? And so again, that's a problem, that the ethnographer has in some sense lost themselves in the group. What's the solution here? In some sense, it's just to be aware of the possibility, aware that you're going to be biased, aware that your loyalties are going to be with the group, and to kind of just remember that you're there to give a study, you're there to research, you're there to observe. Okay, so now let's talk about the reading a little bit, in search of respect. I picked this reading for a couple of reasons. First, it's a great example of an ethnography. It's a great example of a thick description, right? What we have here is Bourgeois really giving an in-depth account of the lives of these people living in East Harlem and selling crack cocaine, right? That's their job, right? And so there's a couple of features there that really make it kind of that highlight some of the things I kind of mentioned, right? So it's, East Harlem is this area here in, in east of Harlem, right? Not surprisingly, right? And so what is, oops, let me go back. What are some of the features that that make this relevant to what some of the things that we have been talking about? Okay, so one of the first things is this concept of anthropological strangeness, right? So, we all of us might think that, crack dealers and people who sell crack cocaine are, such a bizarre world and so foreign from, our own lives, that we may just simply condemn these people. We may criticize them. We may think they're terrible, right? And so really we can think of them, if we don't know them, we can think of their lives as bizarre and deviant. But the goal of Bourgois' book, which I think he does really achieve, is to see the world through their eyes, to not see them as bizarre or strange or terrible human beings, but rather to understand why it is that they make the decisions and behaviors that they do, considering the culture and environment that they live in. Right? And so I think it's a really good it's a good example of this anthropological strangeness, that their lives make sense, right? We're able to see the world through their eyes. So that's the first one, anthropological strangeness. I think it's a good example of a thick description. It's a great example of a thick description, actually, right? You really get all the, you can see this a little bit in the reading you have, but the whole book is actually really good. You get a really complex account of these people's lives. You get, you really get to feel like you're seeing it from the inside, right? And so, I think it's a really good example of an ability to give a thick description. The one criticism I would make of this book is that actually I would say that there's not as much theory as is typical in a maybe a sociology book, right? So in sociology, I think there's more emphasis put on theory, the kind of an abstract explanation of human behavior. But what we really have here is more just description, right? More of a complex, full accounting of these people's lives. And so as a sociologist and as a research method course in sociology, I guess I would have hoped to see a little bit more theory. That being said, I think it's an amazing book. I think it's really kind of well written. It really reads and it's kind of captivating. And I think you really get a sense of knowing these people's lives. So that's it for this video lecture. So hopefully we have a sense now of what an ethnography is, and that you enjoyed the reading.